Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, my name is Atul Tripathi and I'm Honorary Adjunct Fellow at National Maritime Foundation, and welcome to this Lecture 5, the series of ESG Analytics and Green Finance. And today we will be talking about the disaster risk finance, the various vulnerabilities, the use of AI, data analytics in analyzing the various hazards, the role of finance with the various hazards that the world faces, and the various platforms that are available, both open source as well as on the product basis. So let's go ahead and have a look at this series. Let's look at the first thing first. We're talking about disaster risk finance. So we're talking about shocks to stability, and that's a big risk. Looking at, because between 1980 and 2022. Disaster-related losses exceeded about $4.3 trillion, which is about 38% were only insured. That is as per McKinsey and ESG and finance performance. And the reason was primarily because there was not much of information that was available regarding how do you insure the products, or how do you look at the catastrophe bonds in terms of like things like that have often that has very recently come around is Mexico's Fonden or Pacific Alliance cat bonds, contingency credit lines. We're looking at loans that have been disbursed automatically after the disasters, which we've talked about, like products like Caribbean nations and Philippines. And we've also seen products like CCRIF and ARC and CDRIF across the board. So that's where the forecasting and financing is becoming a very important factor, because there is a pre-positioning of the fund based on the weather forecasts. DRF, actually, disaster risk finance, talks about the financial instruments, the strategies, and the approach that the governments, the businesses, and the communities need and plan for, and need to be prepared in case of an emergency, particularly the vulnerabilities that are there across the geography of the earth, which are having very high, natural disasters prone areas. It talks about it will ensure that there's a lot of rapid liquidity and economic resilience, which will help in reducing the shocks of the climate change and the geophysical hazards and the natural disasters that might be taking place. Therefore, we come down to DRF as an ESG relevant strategy, which basically is about linking your SDG goal 1, where it is about no poverty, to SDG goal 13, which is about climate change, and SDG 11, which is about sustainable cities. That brings the fiscal resilience is the one that is there. This is going to protect your public finances from budget shocks, enabling private capital mobilizations through catastrophe bonds, insurance-linked securities, which is attracting ESG-aligned investors, improvement in the climate adaptation finance. So DRF is actually a mechanism which is going to help to operationalize the losses and the damage, facilitating the need under the COP agreements that have been there. Because it's a very layered strategy that is optimal and combined with high risk retention in reserves, and there's going to be a transfer from insurance and bonds. It has been integrated with DRF into a sovereign debt frameworks and public finance management systems, and the banks are structuring their blended finance solutions, linking DRF instruments to social protection and climate change infrastructure that is needed. Essentially, DRF is turning an unpredictable climate risk into a financially manageable event all the way, and it is helping to protect lives, infrastructure, understanding the weather patterns, the natural geophysical hazards that are there, so as to ensure there's a long-term development that takes place. That brings me to another point, and that is why is it important? Because it is financing very fast, because the liquidity strategy around after the climate change and the natural disaster has been hit. It's financing the resilience is no longer about capacity; it's about agility. The right mix of pre-arranged finance turns the shocks into a manageable event, and therefore, if you look at within the crisis that is hitting within 72 hours, that you are able to determine the recovery. The finance is able to move faster across the shocks that has happened interesting point is that only about 11% of disaster losses in low-income countries are insured. This is as per Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, DRR. That is where innovative strategies and products are needed, like the blockchain-enabled disbursement, which we have talked in the previous series, which is basically bringing in transparency, accountability, fast movements of funds, disaster layout payments immediately, mobile money disbursement platform in terms of to ensure that there's a reach to the last mile recipient, and the last mile connectivity is ensured, sustainability linked contingent loans, which has been tied to ESG performance with concessional triggers. It's actually about layering, in terms of the layering of the strategy and the risk level. So if you look at a high risk, low impact, then you have emergency funds and parametric insurance, which is having a risk level from low to medium. And then you have a medium frequency and a medium impact, where your strategy should be around contingent credit and risk pooling. And when you're looking at a layered structure in terms of low frequency while high impact will be there, that is where the catastrophe bonds, the donors aid, and the reinsurance becomes very important, because this risk level is extremely high. So financial resilience is no longer about capacity. As I said, it's about agility. It's about pre-arranging your finances before the shocks actually begin to take place in terms of the lives of the people. So another thing that we're going to be looking at today is in terms of predicting and preparing and protecting, and how will the data be used so as to figure out the social economics from the financial shocks, because the financial risk dashboards, they are providing you visibility in the real times in terms of macro and the sectoral risks across countries like Chile and Indonesia and Kenya, and AI-driven budget forecasting is where you're functioning as your machine learning models for tax revenues and subsidy needed, and therefore being used by countries like Estonia and UAE. And you have early warning systems, which is coming from your multi-source data for food security, epidemics, floods, famine, early warning systems that are there, FEWS, NET, and these are very popularly available approaches regarding the data and shield to shock the economies that might be happening due to the fiscal shocks. Because you see, every dollar spent on early warning is going to save you $6 in disaster recovery. This is as per UNDDR report 2022. And why is the important point? Why is this being data driven becoming such an important thing with respect to fiscal resilience when mattering there? Because you see, the governments, they are facing compounded risk in terms of climate events, supply chain shocks that might be occurring, the health crisis, the commodity fluctuation. So fiscal shocks can lead to your sudden increase in public debt, B, exchange rate volatility, C, depletion in the reserves, and D, disruptions of essential services. So the data-driven action is becoming an integrated cycle, where you have a data collection to pattern recognition to risk flagging to policy activation, and finally your outcome of the monitoring that is happening. So some of the cases that we talked about, like FEWS, NET is a very popular case, which is triggering your cash transfer 6 to 8 weeks prior to the drought peak. It is happening. Another example in the same regard is the case of Mexico, which is using financial stress modeling to determine the timing of the catastrophe bond issues. And there are a lot of global trends in predictive fiscal tools that we come across. One of them is use of geospatial with economic models, where there's an integration of satellite data with subnational poverty and the infrastructure risks that is there, popularly used by World Bank and ADB. And then you have the open government APIs, again where they're talking about the public finance data that is being shared with the fintechs and the analytics partners for fiscal stress monitoring. Then there's the use of digital twinning for economies, where we are simulating your fiscal environments to model the cascading impacts before the policy rollout, which has been piloted in Singapore and UK. So, predictive fiscal intelligence is the new buffer stock, which is actually data-rich, technology-enabled governance, and is becoming the foundation of the economic survival and sovereign credit worthiness. And in that case, we come across a very popular platform, this one by UNDP. If you see this platform, this is a crisis dashboard, and how the countries and the situations are emerging across the board with respect to various crises that are there, about the monthly trends. Similarly, when we look at it from the perspective, the country views, you can get to. So if I play this video for a minute, so take the case of Afghanistan, it takes you through various conditions across the board, where the crisis that took place. Then similarly, you can look at it from the perspective of the various indicator views, in terms of your, the countries that are there in the positive side versus the negative side, where what is happening, how is it improving, who's improving, where it is improving. And then there's this crisis risk dashboard was also giving a world coverage in terms of the deployment status, and the CDR types that are there. So, what is happening with the region status, where the CRD has been applied, and the other CRD statuses that are there, whether it is global CRD or the horizon, and regions have been specified. So this is where platforms such as these are becoming very popular across the board, and therefore you have a lot of data that is being played around to predict the fiscal intelligence, regarding your crisis that might be occurring. That brings me to the next point, and that is about the risk layering, the strategic defense against the climate, the fiscal financial shocks. We talk about the risk layering, which is talking about the reduction in cost crisis responses by 50% when applied systematically as per IMF Fiscal Affairs 2022. So when you look at this entire structure out here, it talks about the use of data and the approach that needs to be taken, because there is a risk layering which is about the financial strategy that is using a mix of instruments depending upon the suited approaches and the different types and the severities of the risks that is associated, because there's a military defense system that needs to be activated, because if there is a case of a natural geohazard or any kind of disaster that takes place, so your frequency of the events, your artillery movements, or any kind of troop movement that needs to be there, the rare catastrophes that might happen in a particular country, that has to be taken into consideration. That's where defenses have to kick in at a very high pace. And therefore, if you look at the risk types, which is being measured with the frequency levels and the financial tools, with look at this medium type, and it's about defined as every 2 to 5 years, which is talking about the use of contingency credit lines like CAT-DDO. And the low frequency while high impact, so you have rare but devastating experiences, like that's where the insurance and the catastrophic bonds and the donor aids begin to flow in. Some of the cases have been, as I talked about, use of Fonden as a product by Mexico, the catastrophe bond, the parametric insurances, Africa risk capacity ARC, which is about the use of sovereigns where you're buying the insurance triggered by fiscal deficits. Fiscal deficit is related to rainfalls, you're being backed by reinsurance and the contingency plans. The risk layering actually works in 3 ways. One is the efficient capital use, so the reserves are not exhausted on rare events. Insurance is not overspent on minor cases, losses itself. Second is speed and scalability, the rapid disbursement at the lower tiers, larger liquidity from capital markets, and when the disaster strikes. It's all talks. And third point is attracting the blend of the finance. So development banks and private insurance, they're more than happy and they're more than willing to engage under clear risk frameworks. So risk layering is about transforming your fiscal vulnerabilities into resilience, which is talking about the balancing of the budget, prudence, capital market leveraging, humanitarian urgency into a single financial architecture. That brings us to another point, which we've been talking about, the budget reserves, which is actually your first line of defense in case of a crisis financing. And only, as I said, about 11% of the global disasters are actually insured. So when you look at a country like Philippines, they have got a natural disaster risk reduction fund, which is actually targeting your climate-related resilient infrastructure, because Philippines is very prone to your typhoons, as they call it in Southeast Asia, and they are extremely exposed to that kind of event that takes place every year. Therefore, targeting their this natural geohazard actually targets their infrastructure in telecom, power, oil and gas, and across the board. Chile has another product like structural budget rule, which is including the reserve buffers, which is supporting your ESG-aligned fiscal stability. So budget reserves, it's about your designated funds, it's about immediate liquidity, because it's where the governments are setting aside a specific amount of budget for the natural disasters that might be striking at any given time period. It's about immediate liquidity because it is able to provide you relief operations or your temporary housing, which needs to be handled in case of a natural disaster for people when they are struck by the geophysical hazards. Infrastructure repair, which is bound to happen in a case of a country like Philippines. It's basically about the speed, the certainty, and the equity that needs to be brought in, because the speed is very important of the highest essence, because most of the funding delays begin to occur after the first 2 weeks of the disaster has struck. That is where the budget reserves are there, and they'll start funding from day one itself. There is a certainty, because unlike the aid or the insurance claims, which the reserves are fully controlled and can be disbursed without any challenges in terms of red tapeism, then you have the equity, which is about providing a baseline support to vulnerability communities, which is waiting for the insurance claims. So how much is enough for a budget reserve? That's a question that every country grapples with. And that's where, generally IMF recommends about 0.5% to 1% of your GDP for the disaster-prone countries, so that it should be replenished annually, and you can have it protected from all kind of political diversions that might be taking place. That's where it has to be strategically engaged with your ESG finance, and because the budget reserve should be integrated with risk clearing and not treated as a standalone. Your donors and development banks, such as ADB, World Bank, they now are able to match and co-finance the reserves. So budget reserves is just not just not for the rainy day, as we call it, the rainy day fund, but they're becoming more and integrated in the ESG critical tools, whether in terms of climate shocks that is evolving because of the impact that is having on human lives and infrastructure across the board, and how will you find an urgent recovery pointer. That brings us to another factor, that is about the risk transfer. Since we are talking about the budgets, the risk transfers is about shifting the climate burden without shifting the responsibility. The risk transfer is actually, it's kind of an insurance. It's not more a luxury, as I've been stressing. It's a fiscal and social resilience tool. It's about prudence that you need to have. It's where the governments are buying time, stability, and the policy space, and so that they can focus on recovery. They can focus on movement of funds at the highest pace. And not at a reaction all the time. That's where the risk transfer insurance becomes very important. So it's about fiscal responsibility for disaster losses that have been transferred from the governments or businesses to the insurers, to the capital markets. And when you look at it from the ESG perspective or the ESG objectives, E stands, as we say, about environment. That's where it is encouraging a climate resilient transformation, and infrastructure, which is talking about in disbursing funds. S stands for social, which is talking about the protection of the vulnerable populations in the case of a disaster prone areas or climate change, the impact that it's going to have on the lives of people. G, as it stands for governance, talks about the demonstration of fiscal prudence, integration of disaster risk into public financial mechanism and management. So the case study on this regard has been one of the very classic case studies, the CCRIF, that is Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. And that's why the capital markets are entering, because their investors are seeing an ESG alignment with the yield instruments. The climate risk is becoming materially financial risk, and therefore the risk transfer is inevitably taking place. It's about diversification that is taking place away from the traditional asset classes, which is funding their adaptation. If you look at the world losses of the Nat Cat losses as per Munich Re, so if you look at the main prone areas across the world, it's starting from geophysical events to in the areas like Japan, which has already had a big share of, I would say, the natural earthquakes in terms of meteorological events, which is taking place in Typhoon Yagi or Hurricane Helen in US, and tornado series that have been occurring, and Hurricane Milton. Then climatological events that are being monitored, such as wildfire in the entire area of the west coast of US, to hydrological events such as flash floods, which has been very, very prone areas. The new areas are emerging, such as UAE and Bahrain and Oman, something which was completely unimagined a few years ago. And therefore, we bring to another point of risk reduction in terms of investments. That's where it's all about cutting your future losses in based on today's capital, because global DDR financing gap is exceeding by $1.5 trillion by 2030. UNDDR report global assessment, that is what it says. So you have countries which are very prone to, like Bangladesh, which is extremely prone to cyclone shelters, which has resulted in the death toll from the cyclones. And there has been a reduction of over 99% in the last two decades. To Netherlands, which is where there's a lot of delta works and the room for the river works that is taking place, that is saved about, it has resulted in $5 billion plus avoided in terms of flood damages annually. And that is where the risk reduction investment plays an important role, because it is about proactively reducing the livelihood, the severity or the exposure to disasters, climate related, environment related, infrastructure related. Your ESG pillars are becoming very important, because investment is reducing your exposure to climate induced shocks, to protecting livelihoods, especially the vulnerable populations, to institutionalizing the disaster preparedness, transparency in public spending. And when you look at the investors and what they should be caring about, it's about the physical, it's about rising your physical climate risk and rising your credit risk. So agencies like S&P and Moody's, they factor in the resilient investments and the sovereign credit ratings that are taken into account. Failure to invest in the risk reduction is now increasing your fiscal vulnerability, your recovery costs, your rating downgradings that have been happening over the time period. Now, if you look out here, the agriculture sector itself, avoidance of losses on the first division to second, unlocking the economic potentials to development of core benefits. You look at the benefits that have been happening out here. Similarly, in case of water and waste management and hygiene, these have become very important factors in life to play around with. So another thing that we need to look at is something, a very interesting concept, that of hazard modeling, which is actually our first line of defense, because you cannot manage what you can't map. That's the key out there. And this is where the role of hazard modeling is becoming very important, because it is turning your uncertainty into strategic foresightedness. And the sophisticated hazard models are able to reduce financial shock exposure by 20 to 40% when they are integrated with national financing strategies. Now, this is as per World Bank GFDR. Now, you see, the entire approach is a very technical and a very scientific approach that has been taken into consideration. You start with your data and diagnosis to going to identifying your priorities. Then based on that, you identify your strategies from macro policies, governance, sector policies, and everything else. Then you look at the implementation and the outcome impact. Now, this is a 360-degree cycle that keeps on happening. Why? Because this is feeding into your sector strategies, whether it is the World Bank-based assistance that you're looking at, because there is a participation from government, elected officials, your civil societies, your private sector, your external partners. Because one of the important factors that we are looking at is the climate risk management due diligence. That is where, based on which the loans and the grants will be taking place. But the question happens to be, what exactly is hazard modeling? That's the approach. The hazard modeling is essentially a scientific estimation of likelihood, location, and severity of a natural hazard that will take place. So let me repeat that. It's a scientific estimation, first of all. Secondly, we are trying to estimate what? Three things. One, likelihood. Two, location. And three, the severity of the natural hazard that will be taking place. So such as earthquakes, cyclones, floods, wildfires, tsunamis. It is here that the models are going to integrate into climatological, your geophysical, your historical data, and the map simulation that will be taking place, because that is where the future risk assessment is going to be taking place. And when you look at it from the perspective of the components, so there are essentially 4 different layers that have been defined. First is your hazard layer, where you're looking at the frequency, intensity, and the footprint of the event that has occurred. Second is going to be the exposure layer, where you're going to assess the risk that of the assets that has happened, the buildings, the people, the GDP impact, and all that. Third is your vulnerability layer. How the assets are going to respond to the various hazards that might be taking place. And finally, you have the loss impact models, where you're trying to assess the economic, social, and fiscal outcomes based on all these factors. That brings us to another point. what is the type of hazard model? I mean, there are multiple types that we're looking at. One of them is deterministic, where you're trying to look at the overall severity. So let's take an example, take the case of a flood or an earthquake scenario that has happened. What is the severity? That is very much a deterministic approach. Then you have a catastrophe-based model, or CAT models, which you call as, and it is a probabilistically based model, very popularly used across, say, when you develop 10,000 sample plus simulated scenarios. Say you're trying to price the insurance or the bonds. It's a very interesting space to be in. The third approach is artificial intelligence enhanced based, where you're trying to do your pattern detection in climate anomalies to figure out what is the type of hazard that is taking place. And finally, you have the dynamic simulation models, where you're looking at real-time modeling with respect to your unfolding of the disasters that might be taking place. So these are the 4 different approaches that are taken into consideration so as to figure out the type of hazard models. And very often they are used in various kind of financial and ESG strategies, such as your sovereign disaster risk finance, where you're talking at hazard models which are feeding into your parametric insurance and triggering of the contingency of the fund releases. Then you're looking at the green bonds, when you're looking at the resilience bonds, talking about modeling which is justifying your proceeds for adaptation of the projects. The private sector is looking towards the banks, the insurance, the ESG investors, hazard models and all that stuff. And your resilience planning in terms of for the urban resilience planning, which is called as, where you're trying to design your resilient infrastructure and you're looking at the zones, the land policy uses all across the board. There are multiple examples. And one of the examples that I would like to take in case of Philippines risk modeling platform, which is also called as GeoRisk PH, where they consolidate the earthquakes, the flood and the volcano hazard models together, and very popularly used by local governments in Philippines so as to have a preemptive evacuation and disaster budgeting approach. And this has been linked to your disaster risk financing strategy, which is very closely associated with the World Bank and your Asian Development Bank's support. So the important point is the hazard models, they are no longer a technical tool. They have become a very integral part in terms of the economic safety nets, the ESG and compliance enabling, the survival strategies, where we're looking at the age of the compounding risk. And when we look at various platforms that are available popularly, let's go to one of them is UNDDR platform. And when we go here, we see something very interesting out here. We look at the occurrence of the disaster. So what they have done is, right from 1970, they looked at about 82 disasters that were, that have been identified. So they have put it on the trend line. And all across the board till about 2020, they mapped out all the important events or big events that took place, about 40.98 occurrence of disasters that took place. And based on that, they have a trend lining. So they're expecting that by 2030, about 560 odd events would be taking place when you look at the occurrence of disasters on the trend line. That also brings me to another interesting factor around it. And let's take the case very specifically, when you kind of disaster we're looking at is a disaster in terms of the occurrence of drought, by 2030. So trend line, again, they recorded it from 1970, where they found about 7.74%, events took place, and that kept on increasing on the trend line. Finally, the spikes that have been taking place, you can observe there, which is very different from this, away from the trend lines. And finally, by 2030, about 20.93 events are expected. So very popular approach towards doing this kind of modeling. And similarly, on the other example of the disaster is an extreme temperature event. So from 1973, they have taken the disaster events and they put it on the trend line again. And, by 2030, it's expected that 20.13 events would have occurred. So in all the 3 cases, we see there is an increase of disasters that will be taking place. And once we have identified, the question happens to be disasters, we have identified, the question that next comes up in mind, where is it going to happen and how is it going to be playing around? And that is where we come to another very popular platform called as ThinkHazard. I would request all the participants to go to this platform, explore them, and see what they can do in this regard. Because if when we visit in this place, take the case of Philippines itself, since we're talking about Philippines, so you can type here, and when you go there, you can go to this country. Various kind of hazards have been mapped out. It's again going to be given on a platform, and you can clearly see what is happening. You can zoom in and you can play around with this platform. You can also zoom out and see. So they're saying that identified the kind of hazard, that level that we're looking at. So wildfire is a very high hazard, urban floods, river floods, coastline floods, and when you put it up, say, take the case of tsunami, which is very, very high intensity or event that keeps on occurring in Philippines. They have also mapped out the areas within Philippines which is going to be, where it is going to be having a very high and low and impact on, and they've also mentioned the kind of data sources, so you can clearly zoom into these various areas of Philippines. You see that. There's a high, medium, and low intensity platforms that are places that are going to be happening. So we can also zoom into the northern part of this Philippines and see which areas are most vulnerable. So you have this Cagayan and Isabela are the two areas that are more popular, going to be very impactful in this regard. Again, play around with this thing and you get a lot of information. So another thing that we can take into consideration is, say, earthquake, which is a very, again, high disaster prone. So you clearly see that most of the Philippines is high disaster prone. However, if you take the case of, say, the central part of the Philippines, you will see why is it low in intensity and other areas that are there. So there are this kind of platforms that are very popularly available. One should go around, play around with these kind of platforms to figure out what's happening, what's the impact on the disasters, the natural disasters that are taking place. And this is a very classic case of, hazard modeling, a platform that is there. That also brings me to another point, is about, cyclone hazard monitoring. Let's look at this thing, the cyclone hazard modeling. How do we do it? Because we're talking about the hazards at this time period. Let's try and understand what is happening out here. So cyclone hazard modeling is one of the various geophysical hazards that has been taking place across Southeast Asia. Now, if you look at it out here, it's got, since 1970, tropical cyclones have caused over 780,000 deaths. That's a large number, and about $1.4 trillion in losses as per WMO 2023 report. So that's where the AI/ML enhanced models, which have been trained historically on the historical data and providing a real-time data to improve speed and accuracy is coming into picture, because it's about short-term prediction, assembling your optimization problem statements. You have this thing like climate data, which is talking about the impact on the maps, to the probability distribution, which is looking at the probability distribution of the people in terms of the event occurring. And that this kind of weather forecasting based and impact forecasting based to better support to anticipatory losses. When you look at the cycling and machine learning, typical forecasting, it starts from the genesis of forecasting with short term and the long term, and various algorithms that are used, such as CNN and SVMs, the neural networks and the support vector machines to tracking a forecast, which is talking about the path prediction, the predicting mining, and the kind of similarity searches. So you have multiple such kind of algorithms altogether. You have intensity forecasting, which is about intensity estimation, prediction, and change that is occurring, to numerically improving your models, where you're talking about the pre-processing and improving the model and the post-processing based on certain machine learning models. So now if I take you back to that previous platform, this is about thinkhazard.com.org out here, and let's look at the cyclone as a measure. When we look at it out here, what we find in the case of Bali as a place, as a case study again, going back, let's try and understand what's happening. Let's take the case, when we look at it in terms of the cyclone, it's extremely medium prone, as we discussed. Now look at this thing. They have played around with the data, and here is they have sorted it out as a medium. But however, they are able to figure out which are the most vulnerable areas. And as you hover around this platform, as you can clearly see when I'm doing it, you can clearly see the areas where they have mentioned the areas which are very, very prone, the districts or the sub-districts, even at that level, they have figured out how much is the impact of the cyclone hazard modeling. This is a very classic case of use of technology. Let's take another one, same case, say take a wildfire. Now, again, the western and the northwestern parts is very extremely vulnerable to wildfires out here, and therefore, if you observe, you see this is extreme red, that means indicating very high. So here itself, again, they have been able to figure out which are the prone areas which is going to be there, maximum available, which is going to be impacted because of the high disasters that might be taking place. That also brings me to another point, is about exposures. How will your mapping be, and why does it actually matter so much? Because your exposure is about systematic identification and quantification of people, the infrastructure, the assets, or the ecosystems that are located in the hazard-prone zones. So take the case of Japan, which is extremely hazard-prone to cyclones and earthquakes. So there it talks about the use of technology and the approach that in terms of identification and the quantification of the losses that might be taking place, because over 60% of global GDP is generated in areas of high risk, at least one of the climate hazards. That is a very important point, because as per UNDDR 20222, because the exposure matrix has to be derived from your climate risk disclosures, your green bond structuring, use of procedural decisions, your insurance pricing. It's going to matter in terms of finance, in terms of catastrophe modeling, the budget prioritization, because the asset classes you're looking at is in terms of the people, with where the density is, the housing, what is the percentage of homes that will be flooded, and the insurance infrastructure in terms of bridges, roads, coastal lines, economic areas which are very, very, which is about GDP per capita. That's where the use of satellite data, the digital twins, and the crowdsourced data is very important, because crowdsourcing is going to play an important role in any kind of geophysical hazard. So let's look at another case around it, and that's about the use of this climate knowledge portal. Now, when we go here, we can clearly see this climate knowledge portal developed by UNDDR. You can play around it. So let's take the case of one of the areas, say Bangladesh as an, or the Southeast Asia, again playing around with it. Let's take this case. So you can go there, you can see what is happening out here. It will enhance itself, and you can play around it. You can figure out the vulnerabilities that are there, what are the variables you're looking at, and if you see that in terms of the data, the temperature variations, the surface area temperature, the average mean, the maximum. You can also look at in terms of the space, in terms of time, how it has been changing, the average mean surface air temperature. You can also look at the precipitation, like all the way from 1960 to 1990 to the current, about approximately current, I would say, from 1991 to 2020. Now, see the way this graphs are changing, because it is indicating the average mean surface temperature, the change that is happening. So if you look at the red line, which is about average maximum surface temperature, which is 30 degrees centigrade and about 240 from 1961 to 1990, and when you change it from 91 to 2021, it completely changes a lot. The temperature goes up completely from 30 degrees in the previous case to now above 30 degrees. That is a very good platform to play around with, and this platform will give you a pretty good idea. Let's take another case. Let's take the case of United Kingdom, another very important thing. Watershed thing. Again, climatologically, you can see how much has been the mean surface temperature variations that has happened. So if I was to take this case and I was to play around with this platform, then I would get something like this, from average mean surface temperature in case of UK, from 1931 to 1960. If you look, there's a complete change from, this is about 4 degree plus, between anything around, I would say 5.74 degrees is the average surface air temperature from 1931 to 1960. It started off all the way from Jan to December approximately. And when we look at it in terms of current, approximately 91 to 2020, what we see is there is a complete rise from 5.874 to 6.5 degrees centigrade. So it indicates the kind of change in the temperature that has been happening. Let's take the case of another one, and that is about your precipitation levels, and just check it out here in case of UK. So when we look at it over the time period, let's play around again from 1931 to, so you'll get enough data points out here. You can download, there's a lot of data that you can download for your understanding, for your playing around. It'll give these are kind of platforms that one is trying to build in today's world using technology, using GIS, using all kind of maps. Because there's an integration with hazard and vulnerability models, because there's a climate stress test that is taking place, as we talked about in a couple of lectures ago. Sovereignty of the risk financing is taking place. Caribbean catastrophe risk insurance facility, which we have been talking about. Contingent credit lines, your climate-linked bonds are being taken, sovereign bonds have been impacted. And these are the kind of studies, that are kind of approaches that the various institutions have been taking into account. So knowing what's exposed, it doesn't prevent your disaster, but actually what it does, it actually empowers you for better investments and the policy decision making and the survival strategies. That is going to be the enabler in this regard. That also brings me to another point, and that is about the vulnerability function that we need to take care of. And look at this, it's about, in Hurricane Katrina, the wood frame homes in low-lying areas saw over 90% structural losses, while the elevated concrete buildings suffered 15%. That's a large number difference, you see, 90% to 15% structural damage as per FEMA and Applied Technology Council. That is where you need to understand your vulnerability function, which is a mathematical relationship, and where you're trying to estimate the expected degree of physical change or loss of a specific asset or a system that will be experienced when exposed to a certain kind or level of hazard intensity. And this is actually, generally it is based on the probability curves. That's where you need to have your parameters such as material buildings, to age of the structure, designing your codes. What about the maintenance structures? Where is it located? Is it on the elevation? Is it on the low-lying areas? What about the retrofitting in terms of how much is, because it will give you the reduced damage ratios. And basically it looks at the hazard intensity is about, it's a function which is measuring your, estimating the percentage of damage or the expected loss to an asset class, and very popularly used in catastrophe modeling to simulate, overcome various kinds of economic insured losses. Basically, risk is calculated as, hazard, HAZARD, multiplied with exposure. EXP stands for exposure, into your vulnerability, which is UL, which I'm calling as vulnerability. This is how your risk is calculated. So it's a function that's a bridge between the hazard intensity and the actual physical or the economic losses that might be taking place. So here there's a huge emerging trend on AI-driven vulnerability calculations using satellite imagery and the post-disaster recovery losses that might have taken place. What about dynamic variability? So you look at it in terms of accounting in terms of the climate change, the salinity of the weakening structures over the time period. Let's look at this platform itself, the open docs and the global earthquake models. When we go here, we see very clearly. Let's look at this. This talks about very classical use of technology for predicting your quakes. This is by GEM, and you can go to the area. So let's take the case of Southeast Asia itself. Now, it very clearly maps out the vulnerability areas, such as governments and there's countries which are most vulnerable. So you can take a case of Malaysia. It'll open you and take you, and here is the entire GitHub repository that you can get to, where they have got all the information required, starting from your XML files to your facilities, your non-structural facilities, the content. That is how they have developed it, and these are very, very important tools for anybody interested in studying and understanding the use of technology, AI for natural disasters and climate change. This is a very important and interesting point of view. Now, if you look again, if you go back to the map view, and we can search out here, we can search based on the country, and we can also play around with the maps to take the case of North America itself. And when we look at the Alaska or the Canada and the contumacious US itself, We find it multiple things. Let's look at a case of Hawaii, which is very prone to earthquakes, and that is where you get a lot of data and information around your non-structural vulnerabilities or structural vulnerabilities. So anybody who's interested in this kind of a study and understanding should definitely use these kind of platforms that are available. Then they have got the Docs Open Earthquake, and you've got the Quake model which is coming around. So you have this kind of vulnerability model documentation, which is giving you complete analysis, fragility, your vulnerabilities, accelerograms you can look at. You can have your studies that have been taking place in the past. This is a very good platform, some of the very popular ones, and these are all open source, so people can go download the data and play around with these platforms. Then comes in the next point we're looking at is about, since we have looked at the various vulnerabilities, various hazards, we're looking also at the contingency planning or the contingency budgeting we're looking at. Every dollar invested in risk-informed fiscal planning can save about $6 in disaster recovery and response. That's as per World Bank disaster recovery planning approach. Contingency budgeting is about proactiveness of budgetary planning strategies, that is allocating funds based on the modeled probabilities of disaster-related fiscal shocks, because it is aiming to pre-position public finances to reduce the recovery delays and the macroeconomic volatility. Essentially, it's about the conventional budgets. They're being often overwhelmed because of the post-disasters, which is leading to your unsustainable borrowing, your service cuts, or the inflation that might be taking place. Therefore, you have the contingent budgeting or the contingency budgets, which is shifting the government from reactive to anticipating your financial or fiscal behavior you need to have in case of a disaster, in case of the strike of a disaster. You have low frequency, high impact events, you map it out with where you're using the risk transfer instruments like catastrophe bonds, to medium frequency events such as, we're trying to have a contingent credit lines using World Bank and CAT DDOs, to high frequency and low impact events, which is being handled through reserve funds and the budget allocations. Things like your insurance MDBs and MDB lines with the sovereign funds and the nation budgets are becoming very important, because this has been integrated with your risk models, which are using your exposure hazards, vulnerability functions that we talked about a few minutes ago, to returning over a contingency line which is being returned over a time period. And therefore, you are having a faster response to enhancing your credit ratings through fiscal transparencies, to supporting ESG aligned fiscal responsibilities, because contingent budget is transferring the uncertainty into a fiscal foresightedness and empowering the governments to get ready for detailing without getting ready for the post-hazard recovery, because there is a lot of destabilization that might take place in the economies. So we have now got open source resilience, which is about a very popular platform, OSIS loss modeling framework, which is open source for climate and catastrophic risk. Anybody who's interested, I'll just take you to that platform. It talks about the open source catastrophe risk loss modeling platform, which has been essentially been developed by reinsurers and the academics and the public stakeholders to build your transparent and customizable and scalable model for ESG linked risks such as floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and more such things. So essentially, they have looked at the exposure data, which is your buildings and crops in terms of hazards that you're looking at, combine them with the cyclone and the wind speed and the rainfall, so as to look at the vulnerability as well in terms of the damage that might be taking place. And finally, you get the estimated losses, which in terms of the insured or the uninsured in terms of probabilistic models. So this is the complete framework that they have put into figure. You have the databases, which is the OSS command, which is attached to your OSS command, where the response and request is going around. You have the web services, which is looking at this. Once you get into the database, you're looking at the inside interface module and the space-based module, where it's coming from your GIS-based network, your ground segment, WSU and UGS, and the space segment JLP has been combined together with the command and control structures, which is talking about data ingestion and visualization and evolve into alarms. That is how it's a very popular platform that is available across the board, and anybody who's interested in it can go and look at it. So this is it's a very popular, as I talked about, the framework, the modeling framework around the open source catastrophe modeling framework, and it's free and it can be used by anyone. They have the modeling platform which can be downloaded, and it's available on the GitHub as well. A lot of information. So here is the documentation that they have, and this is about, you can see they have got model developers and model users, and they have multiple use cases that they have built around. They have got APIs and the camel structures as well. The correlations can be drawn, and they have an open source GitHub as well. So anybody who's interested can go here and look at the wind and the LMF, and the platform can be downloaded. What about the exposure, the data? You can download all these platforms, this platform, and you can look at the UI itself. You can, as you can clearly see, that I've got the entire structures. How does it look like? When you run through, how do you run through it? How do you prepare your build around it? Then, if I take you back, they've also got a very good repository. The GitHub repository is extremely good, because they've got models on earthquakes and other kind of events that are taking place. Anybody who's interested should definitely go and look at this OSS LMF. That's the website, osslmf.org. And therefore, we need to also look at satellites and signals that are being used, and how technology is powering your ESG and climate risk financing, because 80% of the global disaster risk models today are incorporating satellite data and machine learning for faster and more accurate decision making, because that is as per UNDR. The large source of information that is being processed at any given time period in real time is one is looking at. That brings me to another important point, is how the use of satellites and aerial imagery is being used to monitor your deforestations, to crop stresses, water scarcity, the glacier retreats, and machine learning patterns to enhance your early warning systems, to hazard classification, to damage assessments, to automating your flood and mapping extent, to risk scoring and ESG portfolios, to asset level climate responses, to credit ratings, which have been linked to climate stress tests, and the climate models around your general circulation models, GCMs. Let me just repeat that, GCM, general circulation models, to downscale that has been to be used at the regional levels. So here a couple of interesting websites. We look at it as cdsclimate.copernicus, and then you've got Earth data from NASA. Let's go out here and check it out. This is one of the climate data centers. So here they have again given you enough information. If you go out and play around, you can look at the data sets that they've used, kind of availability on the data set. So they've got they're based on the product types. You've got climate indices, to climate predictions, to real analysis that is taking place, to sector-based agriculture, biodiversity, energy, health, water care, everything is out there. Who are the providers out here, whether it's coming from Copernicus or ESA-CCI or the other ways. And what about the spatial coverage, all the way from Europe to global to Europe. So if we click out here, you can also go and see what's happening out here. You can play around with this. So here they have given you the precipitation level from data from 1961 to the present. It is derived from the Nordic countries, the Nordic grid, and so it's a pretty good area. And what about the temporal coverage? You can look at the past, the future, the present, and the variable domains that you're looking at, from atmosphere to land to ocean, regarding the various kind of stuff that can be done. Another one is around this Earth data, nasa.gov.in. Again, an open source platform. You can take the case of climate indicators. If we go here, as it moves around, we can see what is happening out here. That brings us to this point. We're looking at how the various climate sub-indicated topics, they have also gone to the levels of Pacific warm cooling to sea level rise in case of ocean, climate indicators for ocean. Let's take the case of sea level rise. So here they have used a visualization as well. You can play around with these tools. You see out here the level of sea level rise, when one can understand the data as well. You can download, and availability is there. You can understand, if you see out here, they've given a clear-cut pattern mapping. How do you evaluate your climate hazards and inform the environment justice all together? So that's to figure out the discovery of the visualization of sea level rise data, that is having sea level rise data catalogs is also available. You can go around and check these websites. It's a pretty good ones, particularly for the ones who are interested in artificial intelligence and the use of data and AI for natural geohazards and the climate change impacts. And that brings me to the final point, is about the finance against the storms, which looking at in terms of what should be your national strategy for disaster risk resilience, because 70% countries have developed or are developing DRF strategies with multilateral support, and that's where the use of data, the use of AI, spatial technologies, GIS, blockchains of the world is becoming very important. Because you catastrophe bonds, their risk spread is based on the expected loss, the uncertainty, and the liquidity pattern. So the higher the yield needed is better, it's more attracting more investors. And you have your data in terms of hazard data, you're very attracting your cyclones to the earthquake faults, to the exposure data in terms of GDP zones and infrastructure maps, vulnerability in terms of your sectoral damage functions, what are the trigger patterns such as which have been defined and parametrically, either on terms of wind speed, rainfall, how is the model output taking place, the annualized loss curves. There are multiple such models. I would say, RMS is one, AIR worldwide. So let me just repeat it out: RMS, AIR worldwide. Then you have, Swiss Re's and Guy Carpenter. These are some of the most popular models that are available across the board. They're using the probabilistic modeling over 10,000 years. Storm simulations, they have done it. Just to take an example of based on to estimate your losses and the pricing of the thresholds, what is going to be the investors. When you look at it from the investor perspective, they are looking at a higher returns compared to the traditional models. What about the return for the uncorrelated to the financial markets in terms of portfolio diversification? What is that capital at risk if there's a predefined disaster that occurs? So ESG implications are coming around in terms of enhancing the financial preparedness, where you're talking about SDG Goal 13, which talks about or addresses the climate action, to promoting fiscal resilience in vulnerable economies, to aligning a public finance with the long-term sustainability. And the main focus is out here is to take the sovereign cat bonds. They're being made ready for disaster resilience or disaster readiness in terms of investability by pricing or the unthinkable in terms of the natural resilience. And that brings me to the end of this fifth lecture of the series. Thank you. My name is Atul Tripathi, an honorary adjunct fellow at National Maritime Foundation. Thank you.
Hello, I am Shikha Dikshit. I teach psychology and I am with the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Kanpur. Today I am going to talk about what is health psychology. In the recent past, health psychology has emerged as one of the important areas in psychology. It is a field of study where psychological theories and concepts are applied to understand issues regarding health and illness. The two major themes which health psychologists are interested in studying are the themes of illness experience and behaviors associated with that experience. Contemporary health psychology adopts various and diverse kind of perspectives to understand health and illness issues. These perspectives include the behavioral perspective, the societal perspective and the cultural perspective. If we try to enumerate the kind of topics that health psychologists study, the range is very wide. To name a few of the topics, health psychologists study cognitions related to illness, that is health and illness related cognitions, social cognitive aspects of health and illness, cognitive adaptation, chronic illness and adaptation to chronic illness, disability, stress and management of stress. Health psychologists also study topics such as health related quality of life, social support and various kinds of coping mechanisms that people adopt to deal with illness experience. In addition to this kind of experience, health psychologists also study healthcare systems, health promotion and treatment related aspects, including doctor-patient relationships. So, as we see, the range of topics is very large. Health psychologists also use qualitative methods, and they study topics such as narratives of illness experience as well as social representations of health and illness. So, we see that the range of these topics is very large. However, this is not an exhaustive list. More recently, some health psychologists have adopted a critical health psychology approach. These health psychologists are, they offer a critique of mainly of the biomedical and behavioral perspective of health and illness, as well as the methods and approach which is used to understand health and illness. So, critical health psychologists focus on the social, cultural and political aspects of health issues. If we look at the methodological aspects, overall health psychologists adopt quantitative methodology, they also use qualitative methodology, and many health psychologists use the mixed method approach.